Hello, everybody. Welcome to the next Google Photography Prize Hangout with Photo Experts. My name's Aaron Schumann, and I'm the programmer for this series. Today, we're going to be talking about photographing place, and we'll be talking with Alec Sloth. Alec Sloth is one of the great photographers of our time. He's making incredible work all over the world. And much of his work revolves around particular geographic locations or places that he's gone to. So he's made work entitled "Sleeping by the Mississippi," "Dog Days in Bogota," Niagara, and many others. So he's going to be hosting this conversation. And like I said before, feel free to jump in anytime if you have any questions or comments that you want to make. But the main premise of the conversation is really about how and why we photograph places and how we define places and spaces and how we define ourselves in relationship to those places. So I wanted to just kick off the discussion. Alec, you started off your photo career with a project. I've got the book here, but it started off with entitled "From Here to There," and I think that was just a working title for the most part for you to be able to make work that wasn't actually tied to a particular geographic location, but then it developed into Sleeping by the Mississippi. So I just wanted to ask you how you came to that relationship with place and photographing place.
Well, I think it's, what I like about this conversation already is that it starts with all these people in all these different places around the world. And we have this very evolving notion of place, I think, in our lifetimes. And when I was photographing, when I was starting out as a photographer, the internet was a new thing, and it was this exciting new thing. And so this idea of web surfing, of sort of moving through virtual space, was a new idea, an exciting idea. And I had this idea of applying that concept of web surfing, bouncing from one thing to another thing to another thing in the real world. And so kind of like doing a road trip that's sort of like web surfing, in the sense that you're not just driving along a road, but it's an encounter along a road that will lead you down another road and down another road. And so that was the idea of From Here to There, and it was the basis of the thing was to be free, was to not have to follow any sort of parameters, to just wander. But eventually, it became kind of a gimmick for me. Just this idea of linking and hyperlinking. So eventually, I turned it to a geographical line, that being the Mississippi River, which since none of you are Americans, maybe don't know, but it runs the entire length of the U.S. from north to south, and it starts here where I live in Minnesota, and it goes up to Mexico. And I was able to use that path kind of as a metaphor for this wandering, if that makes sense. But the thing that's always hard to articulate is that the work is not exactly about the Mississippi River. It's really about that place. It's using that place as a metaphor for wandering and using it to my own ends. And this is something that for me, happens over and over again, where I'm sort of photographing place, but I'm sort of just using place as a metaphor. So just to reiterate, this idea that the Mississippi can be used as a metaphor for anything, but in my case, for this sort of wandering, for a stream of consciousness. And then I followed this up with the book Niagara, in which I use Niagara Falls, this place where people traditionally go to get married and honeymoons and that sort of thing. I can use it as a metaphor for love. But I have to say that after doing those two projects, I felt like that was a bit easy. I didn't want to go find another sort of water feature that has romantic notions surrounding it. I don't want to use that same formula over and over, so it's changed over time. you mentioned the book Dog Days Bogota,
Yeah.
which looks like this. So just a little book, and this is a book that was made. It was actually, I shot it after Mississippi, before Niagara, but I wasn't intending to do a photo project. What happened was my wife and I adopted a girl in Bogota, and I went there, and then I was there for 2 months and decided to make some pictures while I was there. This is the book in which I'm most sort of uncomfortable saying it's about the place, because in this case, I don't speak the language. I know very little about the culture in Bogota, and so for me, it was really about this experience of adoption and exploring this place where my daughter came from. But I'm just very afraid of saying that I know anything about a place.
A lot of these places that you're choosing to photograph and going to and exploring, it's autobiographical in a sense, or it's a reflection on something that you're experiencing or an emotion you want to explore in your own life.
Yeah, absolutely. And I always want to reveal to some extent my own involvement in the place, I guess. I'm really uncomfortable photographing in other cultures. I do it because it's part of my job at times. But I photographed in China a couple of different times on magazine assignments, but I don't know anything about China. I have the most outside perspective, and I'm more comfortable close to home. Although, curiously, I have a very hard time photographing right where I live. And we can talk more about that. But yeah, so I pick things that are like somewhat autobiographical, and also where I can understand the nuances of the place. The signs, where I can read the signs.
Right. Okay, so when you land in a place, for whether it's China or Ohio for the most recent project, where do you start? Do you just walk down the street? Do you have a plan? Are you looking for signs, as you call them?
I'm always looking for stuff. I'm really bad at just total aimless wandering. That was the thing when you mentioned from here to there. In the beginning, there was always this idea of links, so that if the last thing I photographed was a person frying eggs, the next thing I might look for is a chicken.
Right.
So I'm out there looking for stuff. And with each project, I usually have this kind of list of things that I'm looking for.
How do you develop that list? Is it research beforehand, or imagination, or?
Yeah, and so that list comes from research and brainstorming, and then it evolves as I go. So when I started Niagara, some of the things on that list had to deal with love. So I might be looking for couples, or I might be looking for weddings, or wedding dresses, or wedding rings, signs of love, like that. But there were other things too. There's Niagara Falls exists on the border of Canada and the U.S. And so I had this idea of the Canada and the U.S. as a couple, and so I was looking for something that was a sign of something from the U.S. and a sign of something from Canada. So it might be a flag or something. That's the kind of stuff that over time I got rid of that notion. So I edit the list as I go, and it gets more and more specific. In the beginning, you do look at, you're more awed by a place, and so you're looking at more things.
I was reading that your first book was kind of published by you sending off to lots of different publications and you only produce like a few copies. Is that how you kind of led to finding like yourself involved with Magnum and like rising to fame, or how did that all like begin?
Well, it's a bit of a long story. I mean, the thing about it is that I didn't anticipate having a career doing this all the time, and so I was just doing the work I was doing, trying to get grants and make work, find a time to make work. And once I did Sleeping by the Mississippi, I did end up making these books because, for me, the ambition is always the book. When I said I'm a project photographer, I'm also saying that I'm a book photographer. Like, I always want to make something that ends up as a book. And that was the case, long before I had success and had the capacity to publish a book. Mm-hmm. But I was fortunate enough to have this inkjet technology, which gave me new opportunities to actually make my own book. And now, of course, it's much easier with sort of print on demand and stuff like that. But so I made these books and sent them out to people, and that became, one of the ways that the work got out there. But it's probably not so simple to say that was the only thing. In fact, because it wasn't. It was probably an exception.
If I take it back to the question about your involvement with the agency Magnum, the mm-hmm. collective or cooperative, it seems like a lot of their most recent projects, and especially the ones that you've been involved in, again, just bringing it back to the topic, are revolving around place, whether it's Georgia, the former Soviet Republic, or I think recently you instigated a project, is it called Postcards from America, or?
Yes, yeah.
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 So again, how do you feel like there's some relevance in terms of the agency or the people that you're working with defining themselves again in relationship to particular geographic places or locations, and maybe you want to talk a little bit about instigating that project and why you did so.
Sure. Yeah. Sure.
Because I think
that. Oh no, go ahead.
No, just because I think it's quite interesting. Because I think a lot of photographers sometimes, especially early in their careers, not at the stage you're at, become quite territorial about their kind of patch, and so I thought it was quite interesting that you invited some of the world's greatest photographers whom you're associated with to come and photograph on your patch. So maybe talk a little bit about that.
Well, I didn't invite them to Minnesota. So, stay out. Well, in terms of organizing things by place, this is nothing new. So it's like it's going on forever, and within Magnum, it's gone on for a long time. But sometimes it's not done in an elegant way, let's say, because too often I've found in Magnum, outside of Magnum, it's like, okay, let's make a book. What should we make the book on? Let's make it on Russia. Let's get a bunch of pictures from Russia and put them together, and we'll publish a book. We'll call it Russia. And it's and there's no sense of authorship, and I think what's happening in Magnum right now is that Magnum photographers are getting much more involved as a group in group projects. Because in the past, often books were made because an administrator or someone in an office had that idea. Let's do a Russia book. But now what's happening, in the case of Georgia, one photographer who lives in Georgia had this idea, invited a number of us to go there to make work, and so it's much more authored, and that gives it much more meaning, I think. So it becomes about Georgia, but it has all these different voices, and it allows for all this sort of metaphorical, interpretive responses to plays that I think gives work life. And that Georgia project, it's good of you to mention that, because that really was a precursor to a number of things that we're doing now in America. And in terms of working in America, I mean, Magnum is sort of been weaker in the U.S. Like, so often we have photographers in Afghanistan or what have you, but in some ways we've neglected a lot of the U.S. And we knew this was an issue, and we wanted to play with different ways of working in the U.S. And I've been really involved in trying to figure out ways in which we can be more collaborative and initiate projects that we really want to do ourselves, and this is something that I think is happening globally in photography, where photographers are handling more of the responsibility of producing projects, not waiting for it to come from the outside, but driving it from the inside. And so we did this test project, this 2-week trip throughout the Southwest as a road trip, and to sort of see what would happen. And it was a really unbelievably great and exasperating experience.
Were you photographing side by side? Were you kind of traveling together, or?
Yeah, we weren't photographing side by side. I mean, we traveled all together in an RV, but I mean, it's terrible to photograph next to other photographers. It's deadly. It looks like a camera club. So we figured out this system, and we actually used a lot of social media for this. So say we're driving, and the next stop is El Paso. So we would put on Facebook and Twitter and everywhere else that we're going to be in El Paso, and we would get drivers, students or whatever, to help us out. And so then we would each get picked up and driven off by these other local, knowledgeable people, and then have our various adventures, and then come back together on the RV and move on to the next stop. But what was important there was that we had all that time together in the RV where we could talk and figure out, what are we doing here, what are we trying to make, what are we trying to say, how do we collaborate. And there were moments actually where we would pair off. So 2 photographers might go off together and photograph the same subject. And it was an experiment, and some things worked and some didn't. Interestingly, we also worked with a writer, which I found really useful to give an outside perspective to things, and something I'm more and more interested in. And it's really relevant to this idea of thinking about place, is that photographers, respond to place on such a visual level that it can sometimes feel not shallow, but just like there are other layers that I wish
it's on the surface.
Yeah, that it's on the surface. And this came up to the the writer on that road trip. Her name is Ginger Strand. And in her writing, she talks about the fact that, we go out in the world and, we sort of, if we're in a crowd, we look for that guy that has an eye patch and we look for that person that has an eye patch and one leg. We look for that very visual moment, and we're not always able to talk about these other things under the surface. She was someone, I mentioned hydro infrastructure recently. So the reason I knew her is that she actually wrote a book on Niagara Falls. Okay. And she is an expert in hydro infrastructure and in sort of how systems work. And so she was able to talk about that stuff simultaneous to us looking at the surface of them. And so like this recent Ohio project I did was mostly portraiture. But one of the things that agonizes me with portraiture is that you can never hear people's voices. And so the writer was able to conduct interviews and just give a glimpse of these people's perspectives on social life. And that adds a lot. There's always a question of how you work text and image together.
And in terms of doing, I mean, if you're working so much, because a lot of your work involves portraiture, and all of your projects have always incorporated portraits into them, how do those people define the places that you're photographing? When you go to Ohio, why are you, rather than photographing what you're talking about, this kind of surface or whatever is available to the eye, why focus on the people? What is it about the people that actually define the place?
Well, that's a great point, because I think too often when photographers say they're interested in place, they neglect people. Because for me, the big revelation was when Hurricane Katrina happened here in Louisiana, and all these photographers, art photographers, rushed down there to photograph it, and out came all these pictures of sort of beautiful destruction, beautifully destroyed homes and so forth. And I found it really frustrating that there weren't pictures of people and their stories, and that was underrepresented. A similar thing has taken place in Detroit here. I mean, Detroit is this very photographed American city where there's all this beautiful destroyed architecture, and very few pictures of the people that actually live there, and a lot of people live there, and their stories are relevant. So I feel like, if you're going to write a novel about a place, about Detroit, you're certainly going to mention people. So I think that photographers can be super one-dimensional sometimes, where it's like they just photograph landscapes, or they just photograph interiors. And it's kind of my mission since the very beginning, since that From Here to There project, to not be limited to a single subject matter, to work in this novelistic way, where I can also photograph still lives, or in the case of Niagara, I scanned love letters, and these are part of the work, just as a way to flesh out and give a better, a more well-rounded sense of something.
I think there's something really interesting in how your photographs are always a metaphor for self, using place as a metaphor for the self in some sense. And we've become so accustomed to this, and we see an Alec Sloth photo and we think, okay, well, what is it that Alec desires here? Is he trying to run away, or et cetera, the Niagara couples? Do you feel that because we're so attuned to this, you can now photograph differently? Maybe you can photograph in more subtle ways. The portraits, the guy doesn't have to have one leg and an eye patch for us still to understand the message. So I kind of, can the novel be almost quieter now that we've read so many Alec Sloth novels?
Well, yeah, I think so. I mean, the other issue, which I think your point gets towards, is that it can easily become very self-indulgent if it's so much about oneself, and if it's so clearly about oneself. And that's something that I've really worried about as time has gone by. I mean, the person I always think about in terms of these topics is Robert Frank. Because Robert Frank, I mean, The Americans is this fascinating book where it's about America, and it shows various social conditions in the world out there, but it's so clearly about Robert Frank simultaneously. And he drops little clues that it's about Robert Frank. but that doesn't overwhelm. His persona does not overwhelm the book. And then after the Americans, Frank does this work in Nova Scotia that's really so about Robert Frank, so clearly about himself, so explicit, writing on the pictures about himself. And that, for me, it becomes self-indulgent and it overwhelms the work. And I think it's a real danger, and it's something that I'm fully capable of slipping into. And so I think it's important to still engage with the world and know not every person that you photograph has to be a freaking self-portrait. But you can actually be interested in other people and other people's lives, and that has value too. I do like to make the work ideally out of some sort of personal connection with it. That said, I do assignment work in which I have no connection, and I like, sometimes I like that. I like being dropped into a scenario and just figuring my way out of it. Am I great at that? No. Is that my expertise? I really don't think so. I think there are far better photographers doing that sort of work than I am. Yeah.
Do you feel that you've ever crossed that line and you've made work which you now look back on and think, wait, that was too about me?
Yes.
Is that?
Yes, definitely. Decently. Yeah.
Every day.
No, I mean, I did this book called Broken Manual. That was, it's about running away, with the desire to run away, and I'm very proud of that book, and I like it. But there are moments in it where it gets dangerously close to that, and certainly some of the work I did after that, and I still do things. I mean, I did something quite recently, which is going to be in a little show, but it's, painfully self-indulgent, and it looks like, no offense, college art. It's like, like, woe is me. And I'm capable of that, but at the same time, there's a part of me that likes late Robert Frank quite a bit. And I mean, there's one on the wall over there that I look at. So I enjoy that work to a certain extent, but I think it's dangerous, is all I'm saying. And it's just like, if you get, it's good to look inward, but every once in a while it's good to go out and work at a soup kitchen and to realize that there are bigger problems there with yourself. But it's still good to look into. It's just good to have that dialogue. And that's what I like about photography, is that it pushes you out in the world. It's an outward-looking medium, but you can reveal traces of yourself as you go. And I think, for myself, the work that I most respond to does that. When the work is purely about the world out there, and it's pure documentary photography, I tend to be less engaged in it.
Can you repeat again what you just said now?
Sure. When work is purely documentary, when it's purely about the world out there, I tend to be less engaged in it.
All right. Because I wanted to ask, obviously in your works, I think the one that you mentioned that you most relate to, you mentioned something before about being writing a novel, and I think there is a big connection between your work as a photographer and you bring these ideas that you have about something or not really a place, and then I'm asking and saying what I think. You choose a place that might be suitable to this idea. You want to deal with love or running away, and then you choose a place that is in your mind suitable to to describe
Right.
that as a metaphor. And like, I think you mentioned that before, but it's interesting to me because it's not really like you're not describing the word that you find there. You come with this idea, and like how much can change during the time you're there, and like you already have this in mind, I think, and can it change, or it's already...
Right. No, it's absolutely true. And I edit the place to suit my needs. I mean, one of the things I always talk about with Sleeping by the Mississippi is that, I mean, the Mississippi River has major cities. It has St. Louis. And so you'll have wealthy businessmen. You'll have, many happy families, all this different stuff going on. And I didn't photograph that, and I didn't include that in the book because that's not the Mississippi that I'm making. And it doesn't suit the needs of the project. Same thing with Niagara. I mean, the number one thing you'll see if you go to Niagara Falls are happy tourists. You'll see a lot of happy tourists. And I wasn't interested in that whatsoever. That had nothing to do with what I was talking about. So in that sense, I'm not documenting the place. I'm documenting what I want to in a place. I'm shaping it to my ends. And, a great example of this, I think, is to talk about Magnum again, is that we did this group project this year in Rochester, New York. And we chose Rochester for a number of reasons. One reason is that we were attracted to this idea of sort of manufacturing decline in the northeastern part of the U.S., in the U.S. generally, but at the same time we didn't want to photograph in Detroit for all the reasons I said before. Too many photographers have done it, and Rochester was a particularly interesting place because it's where Kodak is based, and Kodak is going bankrupt, and it was a way to think about that. So we also, 10 photographers descended on this poor little city, and we all had different things in our head about this place before spending serious time there. And we walked away with, I think 10 very different perspectives. I mean, things look very different from each person's portfolios. But at the same time, I don't think any of us would say that we walked away with the pictures that we expected to make. I mean, I went in there with my own agenda, and I came out with some of those pictures that look like that, and lots of other pictures that don't. And so that I shape the place as I go there, but the place also shapes me in the work as I'm moving along.
Do you find yourself more directing than documenting and editing the place? Like the situations that you create to suit your agenda are more directed and more created by you?
Well, the thing is, my belief is that most photographers are doing this whether they believe it or not. And, I mean, okay, so in Rochester, for example, so the plan was, and this kind of came from Martin Parr, and Martin had this idea that we do this box of 1,000 pictures of Rochester. And so it could be a document of this place. And Martin Parr, I always say he's the most purely documentary photographer I know. That he really believes in documentary photography. But my own feeling about 1,000 pictures of Rochester is sort of like, I could go on to Google right now and call up, 1,000 photographs of Rochester that are a document of this place. And how interesting is that? To me, that's the value of pure documentary photography has decreased with the increase of images in the world. I mean, the world, Rochester doesn't need me to document it. It's being documented by people with cell phones constantly. The only thing I feel like I can bring to Rochester is my own perspective, my own sense of authorship, my own way of, I don't know if I'd call it directing, but I would call editing, yeah, and shaping perspective on the place. I mean, you could I feel like you could hand cameras to 50 different people and just tell them, go take 1,000 pictures, and you would have as good of a document as anything else. So it's kind of like the monkeys and typewriters. In the case of photography, they can very easily do a documentary masterpiece, but monkeys cannot write Shakespeare. Yeah.
or Mark Twain.
Right, and I'm not saying I'm more than Shakespeare, by the way. I'm just saying that for me, as like in early photography, pure documentary was so amazing because it showed you the world that you hadn't seen before. It was because it required special skills to do it, and so there aren't as many of these things, and also clean documents of whatever it is, of Egypt or something, and it's incredible. But I just feel like nowadays that's so necessary, and in a similar way, I think it's coming out for photojournalism. I mean, as people are everywhere documenting conflicts around the world, I think it's less important to just have somebody with a fancier camera go to a conflict zone and make virtually the same picture, just with more pixels. I think what's needed is a sense of storytelling and of shaping whatever story that they happen to be. I mean, there still exists within plenty of circles this notion that a black and white photograph is more true to the world, which is just absurd, and it's not more true. But I don't think a color photograph is necessarily more true either. I mean, I think that in that sense, everything is a bit of a fiction. But there are questions of degrees. I mean, I'm not hiring actors and staging everything. And when I work, on assignment, I feel obligated to be more truthful, more to do less shaping of the world out there. But I'm still shaping.
I remember seeing your work the first time, like a couple of years ago, and what I found inspiring, that you go to a place and take photos there, but the amount of photos of people, and also not just portraits. You mentioned before the love letter, or like there's a lot of different styles of photography that in a way they're all still the same style. It's your style, I guess. And if you can say a few words about that, like it's different than what I saw until then. Like usually people go and take photos of people, portraits, or place in a certain way, and I find it very interesting how you add it all together to make one story that is coherent.
Right. How to talk about this? I mean, it's probably has become clear in the conversation. I'm sometimes frustrated by the limitations of photography. I think the medium. I love being a photographer. I love the act of photography, but I think the medium is so profoundly limited, and I think photographers do a lot to make it even more limited. And then photographers are we tend to be obsessed with technique and with equipment, and so the style is very often a real limitation in terms of what we photograph. And additionally, is sort of related to style is sort of, like a trademark. Like, I always had this thing that I would say that, like, everyone's going to say one thing about you, so that in my case, there was a time, let me just go back, years ago when I was starting out, I did this series of portraits of sheep, and here in Minnesota, I was starting to get known as the sheep photographer, and I felt like I could have continued on that way, and it could be Weimarimers or whatever it is. And so you get known for photographing a certain thing in a certain way with a certain kind of camera. And then you just do it over and over again. And I think we too easily fall in this trap. And so often in school, when you're studying photography, it's like you take a good picture of a lone tree in a field. And then the class says, oh, you should do 10 of those and do a series of lone trees in the field. And there's this idea of like repetition of technique as a way to make a trademark, which is appealing, and photography is good at that sort of thing. But I think it's so limiting to the sort of breadth of a project that you can explore. And I crave the language of cinema or novels to give sort of a fuller scope of things. And I'm constantly trying to figure out other ways to make that scope larger.
How do you maintain cohesion when you're doing such diverse stuff? I mean, how do you keep yourself from going off so it's completely disparate?
Well, with something like Broken Manual, I think it can look completely disparate. What really helps is creating the context in which the work is seen, so that, a book shapes the context. The beauty of a book is that you pick it up, and within those covers, you're being led and guided, and it's kind of like, in a movie, the lights go down and you're in that world. And so even if it's lots of disparate images, they're wrapped in this container. I think in exhibitions it's much more complicated because so often you're in like a group show and there's a picture here and it doesn't fit and all of that. But I've gotten much better as I've gone along of doing better exhibitions, which to me means, by better I mean better at shaping the context in which it's seen. So the exhibition becomes more like a book, where you go into that world. And I think it was John Gossett who had this line where he said that being an artist is about controlling the context in which your work is seen. And you can't do it entirely, but you can help it.
Right.
So, the other thing I should say is, oh, go ahead.
Okay, sorry to interrupt. Because I was thinking about the idea of place. I'm in Singapore. My country is barely 60 years old, so we don't have an association as strong as, let's say, you mentioned Mississippi to freedom. So in that sense, whenever I try to draw a reference, what I'm very afraid is that my Singapore reference, it's either lost in meaning or it's hard to recontextualize in another country. So have you ever encountered this before, and how did you go about doing it?
If I understand your question, it's something that I think I understand it, because one of the when I talked about my fear of working locally, the closer you get to home, the more the sort of language and the signs become more and more specific, so that, like, I can tell you what's different about Northeast Minneapolis and South Minneapolis. And they're very different. And I can, like, the architecture has a different feeling. And, but if I were to show you pictures of Northeast Minneapolis and South Minneapolis, they would look exactly the same to you. And so I have a very, very specific knowledge of that. And there is this question, so is the audience for such work going to be only people that live in Minneapolis? And I think, there is that danger. But at the same time, it's something that's taken me a while to learn. It's like, I think the fact that I choose to show such minute details actually gives it life. I mean, what's not needed is for you to go to Singapore, from Singapore to New York City, and show us New York City. Like, it's going to look like everyone's New York City. But you can actually look at something with a kind of clarity that's going to come through. You might not totally understand it, but I think that kind of inside knowledge can reveal things. So, and is that answering your question, kind of?
Kinda, because it is a challenge whenever I'm creating things to make sure that my audience is on the same page as me. So thank you very much for your answer.
Yeah.
Can I ask a question?
Yep.
Mm-hmm.
I'm just wondering. At university, we're always like being told to, that we're like, I'm going into my third year. I'm told that I need to find a specific genre. I'm like wondering how far into your career you decided like documentaries my way.
Yeah.
Did you have other areas of photography you were also like very interested in?
Yeah, I did. I mean, first of all, I came to photography from I started in painting, and then I did these sort of sculptures outdoors, and then eventually it led to photography. So I came at it from this very artistic side. And in fact, some of the first work was very pretentiously artistic. So sort of fake backgrounds and staged and wigs and all that sort of stuff. And then I found that sort of documentary style photography, and it worked for me. But even then, in terms of employment and stuff, I experimented with other kinds of photographs, making other kinds of photographs. And it's something I just kept coming back to. So broadly speaking, I mean, I think it's very good to experiment. I mean, that's what school is about, is to try lots of different things. And then you have to be honest with yourself about what you really enjoy doing. I mean, I think there are plenty of people that are lying to themselves. They would rather be doing, fashion photography or whatever it is. And so, yeah, so I think it requires a certain amount of self-honesty. And that also pertains to subject matter as well. Like, I always think about this time where I wrote a grant proposal for a project, and it was for photographing these war veterans. And I wasn't interested in it at all. But I knew it would get money, but it was so fraudulent, and I think that comes through in the work, that sort of lack of genuine interest. So the thing I always say is, like, if you really love photographing kittens, you should photograph kittens. It's okay.
Or sheep.
Or sheep, exactly. I really like sheep. I like sheep.
What about, going back to this idea of shaping your own context, you were talking about that earlier and how it's really important to kind of set that. So, and genre is like one way of setting a context. You say, I'm a documentary photographer rather than a fashion photographer, portrait photographer. But at the same time, I think in your own career, like you've managed to find ways to place your documentary style of photography into, I don't know, other settings, whether they're commercial or otherwise. But yes, you've done fashion work, you've done advertising work. Yeah.
Well, the truth is, I'm actually really normally bad at shaping, controlling the context in which my work is seen. I am. I've just sort of, I let it go out there on 1,000 different levels, and it was the approach that I took at a certain point, and it's, you know, I think about this a lot. I was just in San Francisco, and I was in this group show, and there was this wall where there was a picture by Friedlander and a picture by Jeff Wall next to each other. And it really made me think about how photographers sort of take control of their careers and also how they shape how the work is seen. I mean, Jeff Wall is incredibly rigid in terms of shaping how his work is seen. And, you know, by limiting very strictly the number of pictures that he produces in a given year, say, and by really being so diligent about how that work is exhibited, the scale, the backlighting, and all that, he's really controlled the context in which it's seen, and I think he's admired, you know, fairly universally, critically, for that. And this sort of came up because we were talking about, in this case, we were talking about the marketplace for images, because this journalist asked, how much is that Lee Friedlander next to that Jeff Wall? And it's a Lee Friedlander picture is quite inexpensive, in part because of the quantity he produces compared to Jeff Wall, the fact that he doesn't edition pictures, Jeff Wall does. And is one better than the other? No, I mean, no, like I love them both, but Wall is much more controlling. And in fact, I'm much more Friedlander-ish in that I let the work exist in all sorts of different planes and all sorts of different ways.
Is most of your work still done using large format, and do you do a lot of work on digital, or?
Yeah, I do. I mean, it's almost everything lately is digital now, but I've done lots of different things. So Dog Days Bogota was medium format film. I've done a number of small projects using sort of digital SLRs. Mm-hmm. And now I'm doing a larger project using medium format digital. And I'm working, this year I'm working pretty exclusively in black and white. And my feeling about all of that is that I do want to be, this is where I use the filmmaker analogy, that I want, you know, filmmakers have this freedom to use the style and technology that suits the film. And so Scorsese can, you know, he can do a black and white, you know, movie about a boxer, and then he can do, you know, he can use animation and all that, and do something else. And I want to have that same freedom on a project-by-project basis, and not be limited by the technique. I am hugely identified with using an 8x10 camera, and hopefully that'll change something.
You did release a lot of photographs of yourself standing next to an 8x10 camera.
I did. I was totally complicit in that. It's true. As my staff members are giggling in the background. And to be honest, I don't want to put a lot of pictures out there standing next to a digital camera.
Great. Right. Well, thanks very much, everybody, for joining us, and thanks to Alec for informing us about everything and being so open and honest about his work. And good luck to everybody, and thanks for being a part of this.
Great.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
All right, thanks a lot, guys.
Thank you. Cheers, guys.
Take
Thank
care.
you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.
The metaphor for wandering and using it to my own ends. And this is something that goes, for me, happens over and over again, where I'm sort of photographing place, but I'm sort of just using place as a metaphor. So just to reiterate, this idea that the Mississippi can be used as a metaphor for anything, but in my case for this sort of wandering, for a stream of consciousness. And then I followed this up with the book Niagara, in which I use Niagara Falls, this place where people traditionally go to get married and honeymoons and that sort of thing. I can use it as a metaphor for love. But I have to say that after doing those two projects, I felt like that was a bit easy. I didn't want to go find another sort of water feature that has romantic notions surrounding it. I don't want to use that same formula over and over, so it's changed over time. You mentioned the book Dog Days Bogota,
Yeah.
which looks like this. So just a little book.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to the next Google Photography Prize Hangout with Photo Experts. My name's Aaron Schumann, and I'm the programmer for this series. Today, we're going to be talking about photographing place, and we'll be talking with Alec Soth. Alec Soth is one of the great photographers of our time. He's making incredible work all over the world. And much of his work revolves around particular geographic locations or places that he's gone to. So he's made work entitled "Sleeping by the Mississippi," "Dog Days in Bogota," Niagara, and many others. So he's going to be hosting this conversation. And like I said before, feel free to jump in anytime if you have any questions or comments that you want to make. But the main premise of the conversation is really about how and why we photograph places and how we define places and spaces and how we define ourselves in relationship to those places. So I wanted to just kick off the discussion. Alec, you started off your photo career with a project. I've got the book here, but it started off with entitled "From Here to There," and I think that was just a working title for the most part for you to be able to make work that wasn't actually tied to a particular geographic location, but then it developed into Sleeping by the Mississippi. So I just wanted to ask you how you came to that relationship with place and photographing place.
Well, I think it's, what I like about this conversation already is that it starts with all these people in all these different places around the world. And we have this very evolving notion of place, I think, in our lifetimes. And when I was photographing, when I was starting out as a photographer, the internet was a new thing, and it was this exciting new thing. And so this idea of web surfing, of sort of moving through virtual space, was a new idea, an exciting idea. And I had this idea of applying that concept of web surfing, bouncing from one thing to another thing to another thing in the real world. And so kind of like doing a road trip that's sort of like web surfing. This is a book that was made, it was actually, I shot it after Mississippi, before Niagara, but I wasn't intending to do a photo project. What happened was my wife and I adopted a girl in Bogota, and I went there, and then I was there for 2 months and decided to make some pictures while I was there. this is the book in which I'm most sort of uncomfortable saying it's about the place because in this case, I don't speak the language. I know very little about the culture in Bogota. And so for me, it was really about this experience of adoption and exploring this place where my daughter came from. But I'm just very afraid of saying that I know anything about a place.
A lot of these places that you're choosing to photograph and going to and exploring, it's autobiographical in a sense, or it's a reflection on something that you're experiencing or an emotion you want to explore in your own life.
Yeah, absolutely. And I always want to reveal to some extent, in the sense that you're not just driving along a road, but it's an encounter along a road that will lead you down another road and down another road. And so that was the idea from here to there, and it was the basis of the thing was to be free. It was to not have to follow any sort of parameters, and to just wander. But eventually, it became kind of a gimmick for me. Just this idea of linking and hyperlinking. So eventually, I turned it to a geographical line, that being the Mississippi River, which, since none of you are Americans, maybe don't know, but it runs the entire length of the U.S. from north to south. And it starts here where I live in Minnesota, and it goes up to Mexico. And I was able to use that path kind of as a metaphor for this wander, if that makes sense. But the thing that's always hard to articulate is that the work is not exactly about the Mississippi River. It's really about that place. It's using that place as